Adele Jacobs sat on the cold steps of Brennan's General Store, her back against the weathered wood, eyes locked on the empty street ahead of her. The wind bit at her skin, sharp as knives, but she barely noticed. Her bones ached with hunger, but it was the quiet ache of loneliness that gnawed deeper, hollowing her out from the inside. The cold had long ago seeped into her bones, turning her limbs stiff and unfeeling. It was the kind of cold that made you feel as if you might freeze to death and not even care. And still she waited. She had waited for 17 days now. 17 days, and not a single soul had stopped long enough to ask what she was doing there or why. The people of Prospect, Wyoming moved past her like she wasn't even there. They tipped their hats out of habit, muttered polite words that meant nothing, and hurried on to wherever they were headed. She had been waiting for her father, who had promised he would come back. He had gone off to find work at the Dalton Ranch, telling her to wait for him here on these very steps. But he hadn't returned. Not yet. And she was starting to wonder if he ever would. Her thin hands, red and chapped from the wind, gripped the faded edges of her dress as she pulled it tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to protect her from the biting cold. Her bare feet, calloused and cracked from the rough ground, were numb with frost. She hadn't eaten in days, except for the scraps the kindly townsfolk sometimes left behind, though it wasn't nearly enough to fill the hollow pit in her stomach. Adele knew what everyone thought, what they had all been thinking since the first day she sat down on those steps, refusing to move. They thought she was just a girl with no place to go, that she was just a foolish child waiting for a man who wouldn't return. And they were probably right. But she had promised him. He had promised her, and somehow the thought of abandoning that promise felt like betrayal. She glanced up the street at the distant shape of the Dalton Ranch sign, visible from here in the fading light. Her father had gone there to work a place that bred horses for the cavalry, a place where good men could earn good money if they were lucky enough to find a job. He had told her he'd come back. He had told her to wait. So she did. But each passing day stretched the promise thin. Each cold morning, each empty evening, chipped away at the hope she was desperately trying to hold on to. And yet she waited. It wasn't until the sound of hooves broke the silence that Adele even realized she had been holding her breath. Her heart, so accustomed to the slow, steady rhythm of loneliness, now raced as the figure on horseback approached. She didn't look up right away. She had become used to people passing by their footsteps, never stopping their eyes, never meeting hers. But this time there was something different. The horse's hooves weren't the hasty steps of a traveler passing through. They slowed as the rider drew near. Finally, she glanced up. The man sitting astride the horse was unfamiliar tall, with a weathered face marked by days of travel, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. His clothes were worn, dusted with the remnants of long, dry trails. But what struck her most was the expression on his face. It wasn't pity. It wasn't the blank indifference of others who had seen her and chosen to ignore her. It was something else, something deep. The man's gaze settled on her like a weight. His eyes, though guarded, softened with some unspoken understanding. And for the first time since her father left, she felt the strange, unbidden sensation of being seen. The stranger halted his horse a few feet away, his boots making a soft thud on the dirt road as he dismounted. His eyes never left her face as he walked closer, his steps slow, deliberate. "Are you waiting for someone?" His voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it much in the last few days. Adele swallowed, trying to wet her dry throat. The words stuck there tight. She nodded through the familiar feeling of waiting. The constant ache of hope and fear mixed together threatened to choke her. "My papa," she said softly. her voice thin and cracked, as if the very act of speaking out loud drained the little strength she had left. He said he'd come back. The stranger's gaze flickered to the store behind her, then to the horizon. He scanned the empty street as if searching for someone who wasn't there. After a long moment, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Your papa in town?" he asked. She shook her head, her long brown hair shifting with the motion. "No, he went to work at the Dalton Ranch." She looked down at the ground, watching the dust shift in the breeze, trying not to think about the growing pit in her stomach, about the aching fear that had been taking root for days. "Has he been gone long?" the man asked. She hesitated, her thoughts swirling her hands, trembling at her sides. "He left 3 weeks ago. He said he'd be back when he found work. He said he'd bring money for food, a place to stay. He said he'd come back for me." There was a pause, a moment, where the world seemed to stand still. She knew what he was thinking. He was thinking what everyone else thought. That her father was never coming back. That she was just another lost girl waiting for someone who wasn't going to show up. The man's jaw tightened as he looked at her, his expression shifting from the quiet curiosity to something more, a flicker of something human. "I'll take you somewhere warm. You can eat something. The steps aren't much of a place to wait." Adele hesitated. She looked up at him, then searching his face for something that told her he meant it. Something that said he wasn't just another stranger offering hollow words. But there was nothing in his eyes but a quiet certainty and something else. Something that made her heart skip in a way she wasn't used to. "You can wait here." He continued, his voice soft but firm. "But if you want to make sure your father's the first one you see when he comes back, you'll need to eat. You'll need strength." Adele stared at him for a long moment, the cold gnawing at her, the weight of his words sinking into her bones. She knew he was right. She had waited long enough to see the truth she had been avoiding. Maybe her father wasn't coming back. Maybe the waiting was all she had left. But then what would happen when the waiting stopped? With a soft sigh, Adele stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She wasn't sure if she was ready to leave the place where she had spent so many days holding on to a dream, but something in the man's eyes made her believe there was something worth trusting in again. "I'm not taking you away," he said as she hesitated. "Just across the street. You can see the steps from there. If your papa comes, you'll see him first." His words, simple as they were, gave her the strength to take the first step away from the life she had been waiting to live. She nodded, her eyes still locked on the empty street where her father should have been. "Let's go then," she whispered. And together they walked toward the warmth of the restaurant, the steps of the general store still in sight behind them. But for the first time in weeks, Adele didn't feel like she was waiting for nothing. She felt like she was moving towards something, a future she hadn't been brave enough to believe in until now. Isaac Rhodes led his horse down the dusty street of Prospect, Wyoming, his boots tapping against the boards of the boardwalk, his face set in the quiet mask of a man who had seen too many miles and too many regrets. The wind cut through the town, carrying the chill of a winter that had yet to arrive, but had already started to make its presence known. He adjusted the reins, trying to ignore the weariness that crept into his bones. He wasn't new to hardship. The miles had worn into him not just his body, but his spirit. The townspeople gave him quick nods as they passed, but no one made the effort to stop. That was the way of these small towns. People came and went, and no one asked questions unless they had to. Prospect was no different from the hundreds of other towns he'd passed through over the last 3 years. A collection of dry, ramshackle buildings with no heart to them, The saloon sat at the corner of the street, dimly lit through its dirty windows, and just beyond it, the general store loomed like the heart of the place. It was a place where people came for necessities, for gossip, and for a break from the hard lives they led. And there she was, sitting on the steps of Brennan's general store, wrapped in a threadbare dress that had long ago lost its color, was a girl. No, not a girl anymore. She looked like a woman shaped by the world's indifference, small and fragile, like a bird with broken wings. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her bare feet were pressed against the cold ground as if she didn't even feel it. Her hands, thin and pale, clutched her knees to her chest, as if holding on to herself. Isaac had seen faces like hers before. Faces of people who had learned to wait for things that never came. Faces worn from days of hope stretched too thin. Faces that told stories without a single word. She didn't look up when he dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. Her eyes were fixed on the empty street ahead of her, as if waiting for someone to walk out from the shadows. Isaac stood there for a moment, studying her as the cold wind swirled around them. He couldn't remember the last time he'd truly paid attention to someone to really see them. But there was something in her stillness that demanded his attention. Something that pulled at him, made him feel like he needed to do something. He took a few steps toward her, his boots sounding louder than they should have. She didn't react. Her eyes stayed locked on the space in front of her, as though she had long ago learned that nothing good came from looking for anything more. He cleared his throat, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, the weight of too many miles in it. "You waiting for someone?" Her head didn't turn, but her eyes lifted slowly, like it took every ounce of energy to pull them up. When she looked at him, her gaze was hollow, a mix of uncertainty and something deeper. Something that didn't belong in the eyes of a girl who was still so young. "My papa," she said quietly, the words as fragile as the air between them. She didn't ask who he was or what he wanted. There was no suspicion in her voice, only the quiet certainty of someone who had waited too long for something that was never coming. Isaac swallowed, unsure what to say next. He studied her face, noting the gauntness of her cheeks, the bruises beneath her eyes. She looked as though she hadn't eaten properly in days. Her voice, when she spoke again, barely reached him. He said he'd come back. She continued her words, clipped, resigned. Said he'd bring food. Said he'd come for me when he found work. She paused, staring at the dirt beneath her, as if the weight of her father's promise was too much to bear. But it's been a long time. Isaac didn't speak right away. He could feel the truth in her words, a heaviness that seemed to settle around them. A part of him wanted to say something to ease her, but he knew better. There was nothing to say that would fix the hollow look in her eyes. He glanced around the empty street, seeing the same silence he had found in every other town. No one was stopping. No one was paying attention. And it hit him suddenly that this girl, this woman, really was just another casualty of a world that didn't care. He stepped closer, his boots crunching the gravel beneath him. His voice softened. "How long has he been gone?" She didn't look up at him as she spoke. 3 weeks, she said, her tone flat, as if the days were a thing that didn't matter anymore. "He said he'd come back. He said I should wait here. He promised." Isaac felt a tightness in his chest. Promises. He knew all too well how promises could fade, how they could turn to dust when no one was around to keep them. The girl didn't need promises. She needed someone who would show up. He glanced at the general store behind her, then down the street. The town wasn't much to look at, a handful of buildings set against the wide, unyielding landscape. He had seen places like it before, and just like the others, it was a place where people learned to survive even if it meant doing it alone. He wasn't sure why he stopped here. He hadn't planned on staying, but there was something in her quiet, unbroken stare that made him feel like maybe he was supposed to. "You can't wait here forever." Isaac said the words out before he could stop them. His voice wasn't harsh, but it was real honest in a way he hadn't been in a long time. "Come with me. I'll take you somewhere warm, somewhere you can get something to eat. You'll be able to see the steps from there. If your papa comes back, you'll see him first." Her eyes flickered toward him, a hint of hesitation in her gaze. He could see the war within her, the part of her that wanted to trust, to believe that this man was offering more than just empty words, and the part of her that didn't want to move, didn't want to give up on the promise she had clung to for so long. For a moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, as if her body had forgotten how to carry her. She hesitated for a moment longer, as if unsure whether to accept the stranger's help. But then she looked at him, a glimmer of something. Trust perhaps flickered across her face. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and Isaac held out his hand. "Let's go," he said gently. "We'll get you some food. If your papa comes, we'll still be here." She took his hand. Her touch was light like a bird's feather, barely there. But it was enough. Enough to pull her away from the steps, away from the hollow promise she had been waiting for. Isaac led her across the street to Martha's restaurant, a small, humble building that offered the warmth and food she needed. But as they walked, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the waiting finally stopped. Would it be enough to fill the hole her father had left? Or was she too far gone to be healed by simple acts of kindness? Isaac didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing: he wasn't leaving her alone. And as they crossed the threshold into the restaurant with the smell of stew and bread filling the air, Isaac realized that this was where something new could begin. For both of them. The warm glow of the restaurant's oil lamps greeted them as Isaac and Adele stepped inside. The thick smell of stew, freshly baked bread, and coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Isaac held the door open for Adele, guiding her inside where a few locals sat around small tables talking in low voices. The flickering fire in the hearth crackled, filling the room with its comforting pop and crackle. Martha, the woman who ran the place, looked up from behind the counter and gave Isaac a nod of recognition. She was a sturdy woman in her late 40s with gray streaks in her otherwise dark hair and a face lined by years of work. She had been a constant in the town of Prospect for as long as Isaac could remember. She was tough as nails, but there was always a softness in her eyes when she looked at someone in need. Isaac gave her a quick nod, then turned to Adele. "This is Martha. She runs this place. You'll be warm here. You can sit by the fire and rest. I'll get you something to eat." Adele hesitated, looking around the room, her thin shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing for something. Isaac noticed how her eyes flickered between the faces of the few patrons seated at the tables. None of them paid her any attention. It wasn't that they were rude. It was just that everyone in this town had their own battles to fight, their own lives to worry about. The silence that followed her gaze spoke volumes. Martha's voice cut through the quiet. "Don't mind them, honey. You sit down, I'll bring you something nice and hot." Isaac smiled at Adele, a gesture meant to reassure her, though he wasn't sure it worked. He led her to a corner table by the fire, the one nearest the warmth. The chair creaked slightly as Adele sat down, her movements stiff as though she hadn't quite settled into the idea of being taken care of. Isaac stepped away, giving her some space but keeping an eye on her from the counter. The locals didn't seem to notice her any more than they had noticed Isaac when he first arrived in town. But that was the way things worked in places like this. Everyone kept their heads down, their noses to the grindstone, just trying to survive another day. Isaac ordered 2 meals from Martha, some stew and bread for Adele, and a coffee for himself. The pot of stew was thick, hearty, and smelled of rosemary and slow-cooked meat, the kind of meal that could warm a body from the inside out. When Martha set the plate in front of Adele, the young woman looked at it for a moment, her stomach growling audibly in the quiet room. She hadn't eaten anything of substance in days, just a few scraps here and there. The food in front of her was more than she could have hoped for, thick, savory, and steaming, but she didn't move to eat it right away. Isaac sat down across from her, watching her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. He didn't know what had kept her from eating, but he knew it wasn't just about hunger. There was something else weighing on her, something deeper that no plate of food could fix. "You don't have to wait," he said, his voice gentle. "It's yours. It'll get cold if you don't eat it." Adele blinked, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they'd entered the restaurant. She looked down at the food, then back up at Isaac as if unsure what to do. Finally, she picked up her spoon, but her hand was shaking just a little. She brought the spoon to her lips and tasted the broth, then paused, swallowing hard. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken since they'd left the general store, and it felt like the words had cost her something. Isaac nodded, not knowing what to say to make it easier for her. Instead, he just sat there watching her eat slowly, her gaze flickering between the food and the fire. He understood now why she hadn't eaten. She wasn't just hungry for food. She was starving for something else, something that a warm meal wouldn't satisfy. Martha came over a moment later, her hands on her hips as she studied Adele for a second. "You can stay as long as you like, hon," she said, giving Adele a small, kind smile. "We don't get many folks like you in here, but we take care of our own, you hear?" Adele nodded, still not meeting Martha's eyes, but her lips curled slightly in acknowledgement. Isaac felt a twinge of guilt, the weight of her silence pressing down on him. He had brought her here, yes, but it was clear that something deeper was keeping her from fully embracing the warmth and safety that was offered. He'd seen it before, people who couldn't accept kindness because they were too used to standing alone. As Martha walked away to tend to the rest of the customers, Isaac took a deep breath. He had seen many things in his life, things that had made him tough, made him believe that he couldn't help people like Adele. But something about her situation, about the way she had just sat there waiting for someone who wasn't coming, had struck a chord with him. She was still waiting. She was waiting for the man who had promised he would return, for the father who hadn't come back in weeks. It wasn't just food that Adele needed. It was the hope that someone, anyone, would keep a promise. Isaac leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his hands clasped together. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "I know it feels that way sometimes, but you're not." Adele stopped eating and looked at him, then really looked at him. Her eyes were filled with a quiet, painful understanding, as if she had heard the same words too many times before, but this time something was different. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I've waited so long. I don't know if I can stop. What if he comes back and I'm not here?" Isaac stared at her, searching her face for the source of her doubt. She was afraid to move forward, afraid that if she left, she would miss the moment her father finally returned. It was a fear that Isaac understood well. He had lived with it for years, the fear of missing something that would never come. "You can't keep waiting," Isaac said softly. "You've been waiting for too long already. Life doesn't stop when someone breaks a promise. It keeps going whether you're ready or not." Adele's hands tightened around her spoon, and her lips pressed into a thin line. The words stung, but Isaac could see that they were starting to settle inside her. She didn't want to hear it, but she needed to. "I know it's hard," Isaac continued, his voice steady, "but you can't keep holding on to something that's gone. You need to take care of yourself now." Her eyes flickered toward the door toward the street outside, and for a moment, Isaac thought she was going to get up and leave. But instead, she placed her spoon down and leaned back in her chair, her shoulders heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. "I don't know how," she whispered. Isaac sat back in his chair watching her. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew this: she didn't have to face it alone anymore. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice low but firm. "Together." Adele's eyes met his for the briefest moment, and for the first time since they'd met, there was a flicker of something, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Isaac to know they were starting to get somewhere. And as the fire crackled beside them, the warmth of the room seemed to stretch beyond the walls of the small restaurant, wrapping them both in the possibility of something new. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Isaac felt like they could face it. Together. Isaac watched as Adele's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her spoon again. The stew had been too much to handle at first, a comfort that she wasn't ready for. But now, as the fire in the hearth flickered and the warmth of the restaurant wrapped around her, she ate, albeit slowly. The silence between them wasn't oppressive, but it was filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Isaac understood the quiet, understood what it meant to carry a burden that couldn't be easily shared. He sat across from her, nursing his coffee, the bitterness of it mixing with the silence in the room. Every now and then, Adele would glance up at him, her eyes heavy, filled with things she hadn't yet sorted through. Isaac had seen that look before, on men, on women, on children too. The look of someone holding on even though they weren't sure what they were waiting for anymore. Finally, Adele broke the silence. Her voice a low murmur that seemed to carry all the loneliness she had been holding inside. "He didn't say when he'd be back," she whispered. "Just said to wait for him." Isaac set his cup down, his hand resting on the edge of the table. He could see her fighting against something inside her, a battle he recognized well. He had spent years running from his own kind of waiting, a waiting that never seemed to have an end. There was no promise of return for him, only the endless road, but that didn't stop the quiet ache from creeping in during those long nights. "You've been waiting a long time, haven't you?" Isaac said, his voice soft but steady. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the food in front of her. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in her words was as raw as the cold wind outside, and Isaac could feel the weight of them settle between them like a heavy cloak. She wasn't just waiting for her father. She was waiting for something to change, something to make sense of the confusion in her heart. Isaac leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He had learned a long time ago that some wounds didn't heal easily. Some things didn't come with answers. But sometimes the best you could do was face the truth, however harsh it might be. "You don't have to keep waiting, you know." Isaac said, his voice gentle but firm. "You can start living now." Adele looked up at him, her eyes dark, clouded with the pain of years spent waiting. "How do you do that?" she asked. "How do you just stop?" Isaac took a slow breath, running his fingers through his beard as he thought about the question. It was one he had asked himself more than once. The waiting, the hoping, it had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his life. Stopping felt like tearing something apart that had been there too long to let go of. But he knew it had to be done. "I didn't stop for a long time," Isaac admitted, his voice quieter now. "I kept running. I thought if I kept moving, if I didn't stop long enough to think about the past, I could outrun it." "But you can't outrun something that's inside of you." Adele's eyes softened as she watched him, the first hint of understanding flickering in her gaze. It catches up to you eventually, Isaac continued. You can't outrun the truth. You can only face it and choose to move forward. She didn't say anything, but the way she leaned forward slightly, as though she was letting his words sink in, told him that she was listening. He knew that she didn't have the answers, but perhaps for the first time she was willing to find them. Isaac picked up his coffee again, taking a long sip, and then set the cup down. His eyes wandered to the window for a moment, watching the snow start to drift from the sky, the ground slowly blanketing in white. He was a drifter, never staying long in one place. He had learned that it was easier to keep moving to leave before the past caught up to you. But now looking at Adele, something inside him shifted. "I'm sorry you're carrying this alone," he said, his voice low. "I know what it feels like to wait for someone who isn't coming. It's a heavy weight to carry." Adele's eyes were still on him, but now there was something different in her gaze. A quiet sadness, yes, but also a flicker of recognition. She wasn't alone, not in the way she had been before. There was someone here, someone who understood what it was like to face the harshness of the world and still keep going. "I thought maybe he would come back," she said slowly, her words thick with unshed tears. "I kept thinking every day that he'd show up, that maybe he'd bring me something to make it all better." Isaac nodded, his own thoughts drifting back to a time when he'd thought the same thing. That if he just kept moving, kept working, kept pushing, things would get better. But they didn't. Things didn't get better until he stopped running. Until he accepted the reality of his situation and chose to make a life out of the pieces he had left. Sometimes we don't get to choose when people leave. Isaac said, his voice gentle. But we can choose what we do with what's left behind. You can't keep waiting for a promise that's already broken. You have to make a new one for yourself. Adele's eyes flickered with a deep, silent understanding. It was as if she had heard those words before, buried deep within her own thoughts. But hearing them from Isaac, from someone who had walked his own path of loss and regret, made them feel real. Made them feel like something she could hold on to. Isaac watched her for a moment, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. But there was something in the way she was looking at him, something in the way her shoulders had relaxed just a little, that told him she was beginning to understand. She was starting to believe that maybe she could live again. "I don't know how," Adele said softly, but there was a determination in her voice now. A flicker of hope she hadn't had before. Isaac smiled slightly, his rough hands wrapping around his mug. "You don't have to know all the answers right now. You just have to start." Adele looked down at the half-empty bowl in front of her, the food now less important than the quiet promise that hung in the air between them. She picked up her spoon and took another bite, the warmth of the food comforting her in a way she hadn't expected. She didn't feel full, but she felt something inside her, something that had been missing for a long time, beginning to stir. The fire crackled softly behind them, and Isaac leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. There was still a long road ahead for both of them, but for the first time in a long while, Isaac felt like maybe he was on the right path. And Adele, as she slowly began to eat, realized that for the first time, she wasn't waiting for someone else to make her life better. She was going to take the first step herself. Isaac hadn't expected Adele to move so quickly. The next morning, she was up early, sitting by the window with her eyes fixed on the horizon, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her dress. He had thought that perhaps the truth about her father would leave her lost for a while, unsure of what to do next. But there she was, already making plans, already thinking about what came after the waiting. He had made his decision last night after their quiet conversation over dinner, and he hadn't expected the weight of it to settle on his chest so heavily. He was going to stay in town. He was going to stay for her, for the promise he had made, and for something he hadn't yet allowed himself to admit. But there was no going back now. He had made the choice. Adele looked up when Isaac entered the room, her face soft, but there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of a quiet determination. He had seen that look before in people who had been broken, people who had been waiting for something to give them a reason to move forward. She was looking for that reason now, and Isaac knew he had to help her find it. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" Isaac asked, his voice softer than he intended. He moved over to the small wooden table in the corner of the room and poured a cup of coffee, watching her carefully. Her gaze drifted back to the window, but there was a fleeting expression that passed across her face, a mixture of longing and resignation. "I don't know what to do," Adele said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where to start now that he's gone." Isaac stood still for a moment, his thoughts tangled in his own past. He had seen too many people struggle to move on after losing someone they loved, after losing someone they had been waiting for. The road wasn't easy, but it was the only road that mattered if you were going to find something worth living for. "I think," Isaac began, his voice low, "the best place to start is by taking care of yourself. Stop waiting for someone who isn't coming. You've got to make a life for yourself." Adele shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers still twisting at the fabric of her dress. "But how do I do that?" Her eyes, full of vulnerability, met his. "I don't even know who I am without him. He was the only thing that kept me going." Isaac took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. He had faced that emptiness himself, the feeling of being lost in the world, with nothing but memories and promises to hold on to. But promises weren't enough, not when the person who made them was no longer there to keep them. "I know it's hard," Isaac said, his voice steady. "But you can't keep living in the past. You have to live for what's ahead of you. You're not defined by him. You're defined by what you choose to do now. And I can help you with that. You don't have to do it alone." Adele's eyes softened slightly, but she still looked uncertain. Isaac understood that kind of hesitation. He had felt it himself when he had decided to take that first step away from his own pain, away from the fear of being alone. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. "You're not alone," Isaac repeated, his voice firm now. "I won't leave you. You can trust me." Adele looked down at the floor for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the weathered wood beneath her feet. Isaac could see the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her, but he also saw something else, a flicker of resolve. Maybe she was starting to believe that the road ahead didn't have to be as empty as the one she had been waiting on. "You really think I can start over?" Adele asked, her voice small, but filled with the first hint of hope. Isaac smiled softly, though there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. "You don't have to start over. You just have to start. That's the hardest part. But once you do, everything else will come." Adele looked up at him, then a small spark of something in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but Isaac could see that the walls around her were starting to crack just a little. She wasn't ready to let go of everything, not yet, but maybe she was starting to believe that there was something worth moving toward. He set the coffee cup down on the table and walked over to where she sat, standing in front of her for a moment, trying to gauge her reaction. "I'm going to the Dalton Ranch today," he said. "I know it's not far, and I think we need answers. You need to know what happened to your father. It's not fair to leave things hanging the way they are." Adele's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "You're going to go there to the ranch? I don't know if I'm ready to hear it." Isaac nodded. "You don't have to be ready, but you deserve to know. If your father's gone, we need to face it. And if he's not, then we'll find him." Adele sat there for a long time, her gaze fixed on the table. She didn't say anything, but Isaac could tell she was processing the decision. She was terrified, but there was something in her, something that was beginning to shift. She wasn't as lost as she had been when he first found her. She was starting to realize that the past didn't have to define her. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice stronger now, a little less unsure. "I want to know. I need to know." Isaac nodded, feeling a small weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right thing to do. The unknown was always harder to face when you were alone. And they wouldn't be alone, not anymore. He had made his choice, and now it was time to make good on it. They didn't speak much more after that. Isaac left the room briefly to gather his things, and when he returned, Adele had stood up and moved to the window again. The snow had started to fall lightly, the sky heavy with the promise of more. She wasn't looking for her father anymore. She was looking for the truth. "Ready?" Isaac asked as he stood by the door. Adele nodded, her face set with determination. "Ready?" Isaac gave her a small smile before opening the door. The cold hit them both in a rush, but it was a different kind of cold now. It wasn't the biting emptiness of waiting. It was the cold that came before something new, something real. Together, they stepped outside, and Isaac closed the door behind them, sealing the past in that small room. The future was waiting for them, and this time, they were ready to face it together. Isaac and Adele rode through the snow-dusted plains in silence, the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves, the only sound that filled the otherwise quiet morning. The sky was overcast, heavy with the weight of more snow yet to fall, and the air was thick with the promise of winter settling in for good. Adele sat on her horse, her shoulders tense, her hands holding the reins tightly, as though bracing for something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Isaac didn't say much as they rode, letting the rhythm of the journey settle into their bones. He had no illusions about how difficult today would be. He had gone to the Dalton Ranch himself, but this time he wasn't just going for answers about a stranger. This time he was taking Adele with him, and that made it different. Personal. They were no longer just two lost souls wandering through the world. They were connected now, bound by a shared grief and a shared desire to face the truth. The wind bit at them as they made their way toward the ranch, the cold cutting through their layers of clothing. Isaac could see the outline of the barn in the distance, the familiar structure of the ranch coming into view against the white of the snow. The Dalton Ranch had always been a place of hard work and cold ambition. It was a place that didn't give much, and it certainly didn't take kindly to outsiders. As they approached, Isaac noticed that the ranch looked quieter than he remembered. The usual bustle of ranch hands, the horses, the sounds of work, all of it seemed distant, as if the land itself had grown tired of its own routines. Isaac led them up the path, guiding their horses toward the stable where the owners usually kept their prized animals. But today, there was no one around. No movement. No voices. Only the stillness of an operation that had long since run its course. "Are you sure this is where you want to go?" Isaac asked, his voice a low murmur over the wind. "You don't have to do this, you know. I can go in and ask what happened to your father." "You can wait here." Adele didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Isaac thought she might turn back. He could feel the unease radiating from her like heat from a furnace, tangible and real. He understood. She had already lost so much, and now the idea of losing the last thread of hope she had left her father's memory was too much to bear. Isaac had no idea what it felt like to lose someone so completely. His own pain was buried beneath years of distance, but he knew enough to know that Adele wasn't just grieving her father. She was grieving the life she thought she had, the promises that had been made to her, and then broken. Adele looked at him, then her expression unreadable. I have to know, she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that clung to it. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that he's out there waiting to come home. Isaac nodded, understanding all too well. He knew the weight of holding on to something that was already gone. It was a burden that didn't loosen until you let it go. And Adele was starting to realize that, just like he had all those years ago. Together, they rode the last stretch of the path to the barn, where Isaac dismounted first and held his hand out to Adele. She hesitated only for a moment before taking his hand, the cold of the metal barn gate biting through her gloves as they approached. Isaac glanced around, taking in the stillness of the place. He hadn't seen anyone in the stable, hadn't heard any sounds from the barn. The place felt empty, abandoned, even though it was still standing. "I'll go inside," Isaac said, his voice low and measured. "Stay here for a moment." Adele didn't protest, but she didn't move either. She stood just outside the barn doors, her eyes following Isaac's every movement as he walked into the barn. The door creaked on its hinges as he pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. The smell of hay and dust filled the air, the silence hanging heavy in the rafters. Isaac's boots echoed as he stepped inside, the light filtering through cracks in the barn's walls, illuminating the empty stalls. The horses were gone, had been for a while by the look of the place. Dust covered everything, and the once pristine tack had been left behind, forgotten. He moved deeper into the barn, his hand brushing against the cold wood of the stalls. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he made his way to the far corner, where a desk sat cluttered with papers. It was there that he found what he was looking for, the ledger. Isaac opened it, scanning the pages quickly. The names of workers, dates, and transactions jumped out at him. But there toward the back was a notation that made his stomach tighten. The name of Adele's father, Samuel Jacobs, appeared under the list of men who had come and gone from the ranch. But there was no date indicating when he'd left, no mention of his death, just a note that read, "Missing after an accident." Isaac's heart sank as he read the words again. Missing. He closed the ledger slowly, his hands shaking. This was not the news he had hoped to find. He had thought maybe there would be some mistake. A mix-up, some hope that Samuel Jacobs was still out there, still working on the ranch, waiting for someone to remember him. But the words were final. The man who had promised to return to his daughter was gone. Isaac stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He had to go back to Adele and tell her. But how do you break the news to someone that the last shred of hope they were holding on to had already slipped away? He walked back toward the barn door, the sound of his boots muted in the heavy silence. When he stepped back outside, Adele was waiting by the gate, her eyes fixed on him, her expression unreadable. She had known before he even opened his mouth. The look on his face told her everything she needed to know. Isaac stopped just in front of her, taking a deep breath before he spoke. "He's gone, Adele. Your father. He's been gone for a while. They don't know exactly what happened. He was missing after an accident." Adele's face didn't change at first. She blinked as if the words hadn't quite landed, and then slowly, as though the air had suddenly become too thick to breathe, she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "No, he promised." Isaac reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "I'm sorry. I wish it wasn't this way, but he's gone. You need to let go of this, Adele." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She held them back with a quiet strength, her chest rising and falling as though she was trying to hold herself together. She had been holding on for so long, and now there was nothing left to hold on to. I don't know how she whispered the words, a quiet surrender. I don't know how to let go. Isaac watched her for a long moment before speaking again. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly. I'm here. We'll figure this out together. You don't have to carry this alone. Adele looked up at him, then her eyes filled with so many things, grief, confusion, and something else, something that hadn't been there before. For the first time since Isaac had met her, he saw a flicker of something like hope. A fragile thing, but it was there. We'll get through this, Isaac said quietly, the certainty in his voice reaching her, even though the road ahead still seemed uncertain. They stood there for a long moment, the cold air swirling around them, but for the first time in a long time, Adele felt a small warmth inside her. Maybe this was the beginning of something. Maybe, just maybe, this was where she could start moving forward. Isaac and Adele rode back to town in silence, the weight of the words they'd spoken hanging between them, like a cloud that refused to break. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, the world around them fading into a soft, white blur. The horses' hooves crunched in the snow, breaking the otherwise still air, and Isaac felt a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Adele hadn't spoken since they'd left the ranch, and Isaac hadn't pressed her to. He didn't expect her to react immediately. Grief didn't work that way, at least not for him. He had learned that the hard way, the painful way, long before he ever set foot in Prospect. He had seen people lose themselves in sorrow, their world falling apart around them. He'd been that person once. He glanced over at Adele, her face obscured by the hood of her coat, her posture stiff. Her jaw was set, her eyes fixed straight ahead, but Isaac could feel the storm inside her. It was only a matter of time before it all came out. The tears, the anger, the questions she hadn't yet voiced. When they reached the outskirts of Prospect, Isaac steered his horse off the path toward the small cabin he'd made his home. The wind was biting and the falling snow swirled around them, the air thick with the quiet of the wilderness. Isaac dismounted, reaching for Adele's reins. She hesitated, looking at him for a long moment, before sliding off her horse and standing by his side. "You don't have to do this alone," Isaac said, his voice softer than before. "We'll figure this out, Adele. You don't need to carry this burden on your own." Adele looked at him, then her eyes searching his face as if trying to find something in him that could give her the strength to keep going. She hadn't asked for this help, but Isaac had offered it anyway, and somewhere in the quiet of their shared grief, it felt right. She didn't have the words to say it, but she felt it, she knew it, and that knowledge was enough to make her believe, even if just for a moment, that maybe she could move forward. "I don't know how to stop waiting," she said. Her voice breaking slightly as she spoke, the weight of her grief pressing down on her chest. Isaac looked at her, his expression hardening with understanding. "You can't keep waiting for something that's already gone, Adele. I know it's hard, but you can't live in the past." Adele swallowed her throat dry, but she didn't speak again. Isaac could see her fighting with herself, holding on to the last vestiges of hope that one day her father would come back. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. He was gone, and no amount of waiting would bring him back. They moved toward the cabin together, the snow falling heavier now, the world blanketed in white. Isaac pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The warmth of the fire hit them instantly, and Isaac gestured for Adele to sit by the hearth. She did her movements slow, her hands trembling as she pulled her gloves off and set them on the small table nearby. Isaac sat across from her, the fire crackling between them, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He knew there was nothing more to say, at least not yet. It was too soon for the words to make any sense. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like something they both needed, something that allowed them to be in the moment without the pressure of needing to fix everything. Adele glanced at him, her face weary, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again as if the words weren't ready yet. Isaac didn't press her. He just sat there watching the fire dance, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. Finally, after what felt like hours, Adele spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to move on." Isaac exhaled slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He could see the vulnerability in her now, the cracks in the armor she had built around herself. "You don't have to know right now, but you will. It's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen." Adele's gaze dropped to her hands. Her fingers curled tightly together in her lap. She was silent for a long moment, and Isaac wondered if she would speak again. But then she looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as though she were trying to understand something about him, something deeper than the words they had exchanged. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice steady, but the question hung in the air between them. Isaac looked at her, his own questions bubbling to the surface. Why had he chosen to stay? Why had he offered to help her when he barely knew her? He could have kept moving, kept running, but something had stopped him. Something had made him realize that he couldn't walk away from this, from her. "I don't know," Isaac said finally, his voice quiet, his gaze not leaving hers. I guess I'm tired of running from things. I spent too many years running from my own pain, and it didn't get me anywhere. You can't outrun what's inside you." Adele stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable, and Isaac felt the weight of her gaze like a heavy stone pressing on his chest. There was something in her eyes, something that made him believe that maybe she wasn't as lost as she seemed. She was finding her way little by little, and maybe he was a part of that. She looked away out the window, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. But then slowly she stood, crossing the room to where Isaac had set down his coat. She pulled it off the hook and wrapped it around her shoulders, her movements slow but deliberate. Isaac raised an eyebrow as he watched her. "What are you doing?" Adele didn't respond immediately. She just stood there staring at the door, as though something was calling her, something beyond the cabin and the fire and the warmth that surrounded them. Then finally, she turned to him. "I'm not going to wait anymore," she said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "I'm going to go to the town. I'm going to start over." Isaac stood, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'll go with you." Adele nodded, the firelight catching in her eyes as she stepped toward the door. There was no hesitation in her now. She had made her choice, and Isaac, for the first time in a long while, knew that he had made his own. Isaac watched Adele as she stood at the edge of the cabin, the wind tugging at her coat and hair. The door was cracked open, and the light from the fire flickered behind her, casting a warm glow that seemed to contrast with the cold air outside. Her face was a mask of quiet determination. Her eyes focused on something far off beyond the horizon, as if trying to find a future that had eluded her for so long. She had made her decision. It was clear in the way she held herself now, like a person who had spent too long standing still, but who was finally ready to take that first step forward. "You don't have to go alone," Isaac said, his voice breaking the stillness. He stood a few feet away from her, his own coat draped over his arm, as he watched her prepare to leave the safety of the cabin of the fire, of the only place that had offered her comfort in the past few days. Adele turned her head toward him, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'm not alone," she said quietly. "I have you." Isaac wasn't sure if she was saying it to convince him or herself. He nodded slowly, stepping toward her, the snow crunching beneath his boots. "Then let's go together," he said, his voice firm, though he could feel the unease rising in his chest. The road ahead was unknown, both for him and for her. They had come so far already, but the real test was just beginning. Adele met his gaze, her eyes softer than they had been before. There was a tenderness there now, an understanding that had grown between them over the past few days. The truth had come in pieces, each one a bit harder to accept than the last. But now, as they stood on the threshold of the world outside, there was a kind of quiet strength between them. Together, they stepped into the cold, the wind biting at their skin, the world outside stark and white, the snow clinging to the trees, and the ground like a blanket that had just been thrown over everything. The town of Prospect seemed farther away than it actually was, the distance between them growing in Isaac's mind as they made their way through the snow. The cabin faded behind them, swallowed by the whiteness, until there was only the path ahead. Isaac's mind raced as they walked. He had made a promise to himself when he had arrived in this town to keep moving, to never settle, to never stay long enough for anyone to depend on him. But he had broken that promise, hadn't he? Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't walk away from someone who needed him. Adele needed him in a way that he couldn't ignore. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had been waiting too. Waiting for the right moment to stop running, to face the things he had left behind. The road had led him here for a reason, to this moment, to this woman who had taught him something about healing, about living in spite of everything that had been lost. Adele walked beside him, her steps slow but steady, her breath clouding in the cold air. She didn't look at him as she walked, but Isaac could feel the tension in her. She was carrying something heavier than the snow, something that she hadn't yet let go of. But there was a change in her now, something that made Isaac believe she was ready to move forward, ready to leave the past behind and create something new. As they approached the town, the sound of distant voices reached them. Nothing clear, just the muffled hum of life continuing as usual, even in the face of everything that had happened. Isaac couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this place, even though he had spent the past week here, getting to know its rhythms, its people. But now, walking alongside Adele, he realized how much he had missed in his years of solitude. When they reached the main street, Isaac stopped, taking in the sight of the small town. It wasn't much, just a few buildings lined up against the road, but it had a life to it. The people who lived here, though quiet and distant, had a purpose. They worked, they struggled, they survived. They didn't ask for help, and they didn't give it unless it was necessary. Adele paused beside him, her eyes scanning the familiar scene. There was something unsettling in her gaze, a mixture of recognition and wariness. She had been here before, but this place didn't feel like home anymore. Not now that everything she had known was gone. Isaac could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched at her sides. She was ready to face this, but the weight of what it meant was still settling in her chest. "I can't go back," Adele said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to him, then her eyes searching his face, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. "I can't just stay here and pretend nothing has changed. Everything's different now." Isaac nodded slowly. He knew that feeling. He knew what it was like to look at a place you once thought was home and realize that it wasn't. It wasn't the place that had changed. It was you. "You don't have to go back," he said softly. "You don't have to stay here. You can move forward." Adele took a deep breath, and Isaac could see the decision forming in her eyes. She wasn't looking for a way to turn back anymore. She was looking for a way to step into the world that lay before her, even if it was terrifying. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know where to start." Isaac gave her a reassuring smile, his hand resting on the small of her back as they continued walking. "You start with what you know. You start with today." They passed a few more houses, the streets quiet, and Isaac could see the familiar faces of the townsfolk glancing out of their windows, watching them as they passed. It wasn't as welcoming as Isaac had hoped, but then again, no one had ever promised them welcome. When they reached the small cafe at the end of the street, Isaac turned to her. "Let's stop here. It's warm inside, and I think you need a moment." "We both do." Adele nodded, her shoulders relaxing as she stepped through the door. The warmth of the cafe hit them immediately, and Isaac led her to a corner table by the window. The snow outside was falling in thick, soft flakes, and the world felt quieter inside, as though the storm had been left behind on the other side of the door. They sat in silence for a few moments, the soft murmur of the other patrons in the background. Isaac ordered a hot drink for both of them, and Adele wrapped her hands around the mug when it arrived, feeling the warmth seep through her cold fingers. Isaac took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it down, his gaze fixed on Adele. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice steady, the weight of their shared journey grounding him. "We're in this together, okay?" Adele met his gaze, her eyes softening. She didn't have the words to say it, but she nodded. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time since she had stepped outside the cabin, she felt like she had a chance at something more. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around them like a blanket as Adele slowly took another sip of her drink. The hot liquid burned her throat at first, but she welcomed the heat. She hadn't realized just how cold she had been until she felt the warmth seep through her bones. Isaac sat across from her, watching the steam curl up from his own coffee, his eyes thoughtful but patient. Outside, the snow still fell, coating the town in a quiet white veil, but inside the cafe, the world seemed to pause. For the first time in days, Adele wasn't thinking about the loss, the waiting, or the emptiness. She wasn't thinking about her father or the promise he made. She was just here in this small cafe with Isaac, a man who, despite his own past, had become someone she could rely on. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, like two people who didn't need words to understand each other. But the quiet was also filled with unspoken questions about the future, about what came next. Isaac could feel it in the air, the question that hung between them like a thread that was slowly pulling them forward, even though neither of them had quite figured out where they were headed. Finally, Adele set her mug down on the table, her hands steady for the first time that morning. She met Isaac's gaze, her expression resolute. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the question itself held a weight too heavy to bear. Isaac didn't hesitate. He had been waiting for her to ask, even though he wasn't sure how to answer. But there was a clarity now that hadn't been there before. They had both faced the truth, however painful, and now they had to find a way to move forward. There was no going back, no undoing what had already been done. All they had now was today, and the possibility of a tomorrow that they could shape together. "We start," Isaac said simply, his voice firm but gentle. "We don't have to know exactly how, but we start. You can't wait forever, Adele. No one can. You've already taken the hardest step by facing the truth about your father. Now you have to take the next one. For you." Adele nodded slowly, her eyes flickering to the window, where the snow was falling in thick sheets. The world outside was both beautiful and cold, just like the feelings she was trying to make sense of. But Isaac was right. She couldn't keep waiting. She couldn't stay frozen in time, holding on to something that was never coming back. The reality of it was painful, but it also freed her in a way she hadn't expected. "And what about you?" Adele asked, her voice still soft, but with a quiet edge of curiosity. "Where do you go from here?" Isaac's gaze softened, and for a moment he looked away as if the question had caught him off guard. He hadn't really thought about what came next for him. He had spent so much time focused on Adele, on helping her, that he hadn't stopped to consider his own place in all of this. But now as he looked at her, he realized that she wasn't the only one who needed to move forward. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice steady. "I've been running for a long time, trying to outrun the past, trying to outrun the things I've lost. But I've started to realize that maybe I don't need to run anymore. Maybe it's time to stop and figure out what I'm really here for." Adele studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly, as if she was seeing him for the first time. She had always seen Isaac as someone who carried a quiet strength, a man who had lived through pain and loss, and had come out the other side hardened but not broken. But now there was something more. There was something vulnerable in him, a man who was finally admitting that he didn't have all the answers. And for the first time, Adele saw the possibility of growth, not just for herself, but for him too. The idea of moving forward, of starting over, felt like a heavy burden, but also like a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had spent so much of her life waiting for something that wasn't coming, that she had forgotten how to take control of her own life. But here now with Isaac, she realized that she didn't have to wait for someone else to save her. She could save herself. She took a deep breath, her eyes steady, now her mind made up. "I'm ready to start over," she said, her voice firm but calm. "I'm ready to live again. I can't keep holding on to the past." Isaac smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He could see the change in her, the shift from uncertainty to determination. He had seen it in himself too, in the way he had stopped running, in the way he had decided to stay and face what was in front of him. "We'll figure it out together," Isaac said, his voice steady, offering her the same kind of reassurance he had needed for himself. "You don't have to do it alone." Adele met his gaze, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and hope. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long while she was ready to face it. She was ready to stop waiting and start living. The door to the cafe opened, and a gust of cold air swept in, followed by a pair of townsfolk who had just come in from the snow. Isaac and Adele turned toward the new arrivals, but Adele's gaze lingered on the window for a moment longer, the snowflakes swirling outside. For a moment she thought about her father, about the promises that had been made and broken. She thought about the days she had spent waiting for something that would never come. But then she looked at Isaac, and for the first time she didn't feel alone. She didn't feel like she was waiting for anything anymore. "Let's go," Isaac said, standing up and offering his hand. "We've got a future to build." Adele took his hand, the warmth of it steadying her, and together they stepped out into the cold. The world outside was still, but there was a quiet promise in the air, a promise that the road ahead, though uncertain, was one they would walk together, and that for the first time felt like enough. As they walked through the falling snow, Isaac felt a weight lift from his chest. He didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need to. He had made a choice, and for the first time in years, he wasn't running anymore. He was here with Adele, and that was enough for now. The future was waiting, and together they would face it. The morning sun was weak, struggling to break through the heavy clouds that had been hanging over Prospect for days. Isaac and Adele were out early, their boots crunching in the fresh snow as they made their way through the streets. The town was still sleepy, most people holed up in their homes trying to escape the chill. But Isaac and Adele had decided it was time to take the next step. Time to face the world outside the small insulated circle they had found in the cafe, time to start the work of moving forward. Adele felt the weight of her decision settling in as they walked. It wasn't as simple as just deciding to live again. She had spent so long carrying her grief, clinging to the hope that her father would return, that the idea of moving on felt foreign. But Isaac had given her something she hadn't known she needed permission to let go. Permission to stop waiting and start doing. She glanced sideways at him. Isaac was walking with a steady, unhurried gait, his eyes focused straight ahead. He had always been a man of few words, but his presence, his quiet certainty, had a way of making her feel like maybe she could be strong too. Like maybe she could do this, even if it scared her. They walked toward the edge of town, where the dusty road led toward the ranches that stretched out into the distance. Isaac had said they would start by finding some work for Adele, something to give her purpose. And although the thought of working, of stepping into a life that didn't involve waiting, made her nervous, it was a kind of nervousness that felt alive. It was the kind of fear that meant she was doing something new, something that could change everything. The wind cut through them as they walked, but Adele didn't mind it. The cold seemed to sharpen her thoughts, push her forward. She wasn't waiting for her father anymore. She was moving with Isaac in step with someone who was helping her find the way out of the fog she'd been trapped in. Isaac stopped outside a small barn, its wooden beams weathered by years of wind and snow. It was the place Isaac had mentioned when they'd first talked about getting her started. He'd told her about a ranch nearby that was looking for help, and it seemed as good a place to start as any. "This is it," Isaac said, turning to Adele. "Let's see what they've got for you." Adele hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't used to this kind of life, used to being out in the open, working with her hands. But Isaac was right. She couldn't keep waiting for something that wasn't coming. She had to try. She had to see if there was something else for her. Isaac gave her a reassuring nod before knocking on the door. It opened after a moment, and a tall man in his 50s appeared, his face weathered from years of working outside. He was dressed in a flannel shirt and worn jeans, his hands calloused from labor. He studied Isaac for a moment before his eyes shifted to Adele. "Isaac," the man said gruffly. "What brings you out here?" Isaac's tone was casual but firm. "I've got someone here looking for work. This is Adele. Thought you might need an extra hand." The man raised an eyebrow but stepped aside to let them in. "Adele, huh? You're looking for work?" Adele nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She wasn't sure how to answer. She wasn't used to being looked at like she was something more than a passing stranger. The man seemed to size her up, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "I can work," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." The man nodded slowly, his face softening a little. "We can always use help around here. We've got plenty of chores to do. You'll start by mucking out the stalls. It's hard work, but it's honest. You up for it?" Adele didn't hesitate. "Yes, I can do it." The man gave a short, approving grunt and motioned for her to follow him. "Follow me, then. I'll show you the ropes." Isaac stayed behind, watching Adele as she followed the man into the barn. She was already getting to work, already stepping into the role of someone who wasn't waiting anymore. Isaac felt a small pang in his chest, a mix of pride and something else he couldn't name. She was doing it. She was moving forward. Isaac leaned against the wall of the barn, watching as the man showed Adele how to clean the stalls, the steady rhythm of her movements calming his thoughts. He had always been good at keeping his distance, never letting anyone get too close. But something about Adele had changed that. Something about her had made him stop running and face the things he had been avoiding for years. Adele was working hard, her hands moving quickly as she cleaned the stalls, her brow furrowed in concentration. Isaac knew the work wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that it was the kind of work that could fill the emptiness inside someone. The kind of work that gave purpose even if it wasn't glamorous. After a few hours, the man came back to check on them. He nodded in approval when he saw how quickly Adele had caught on. "You're doing good," he said gruffly. Keep it up and we'll have a place for you here. Adele wiped the sweat from her brow and looked up at Isaac, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And Isaac could see the change in her, see the way she was beginning to let go of the past, little by little. "Thanks," she said quietly, the exhaustion in her voice clear but not discouraging. "I didn't think I'd be able to do this, but it feels good." Isaac smiled back at her, his chest warm with something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "You're stronger than you think." They worked for the rest of the afternoon, the sun sinking lower in the sky as the day drew to a close. When they finished, the man gave them both a nod and a simple thanks before heading off to take care of his own chores. Isaac and Adele stood outside the barn, the cool air wrapping around them. Adele looked over at Isaac, her expression quiet, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had taken the first step. She had done something for herself, not for anyone else, but for her own peace of mind. Isaac could feel the change in the air, like something had shifted between them. They were no longer waiting. They were living. "You did good today," Isaac said, his voice low but warm. Adele nodded slowly. "I did. It wasn't easy, but I did it." Isaac met her gaze, the silence between them full of a quiet understanding. They didn't need to say anything more. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time it didn't seem so daunting. As they walked back toward the cabin, the snow continued to fall, the world around them blanketed in white. The past was still there, lingering in the back of their minds, but it was no longer the only thing that defined them. They were both starting over in their own way, and for the first time, Isaac felt like maybe they were both going to be okay. The days passed quietly in Prospect, the steady rhythm of work settling into a routine. Isaac had always found comfort in the familiarity of routine, the predictable tasks that came with ranch life. But he noticed that Adele was finding something else in it, something that had nothing to do with survival. It wasn't just the work that was shaping her. It was the way she had started to carry herself differently. There was still a quiet wariness in her eyes, but it was softer now, as if she was learning how to trust again, learning how to believe in herself. Isaac had known from the start that Adele was strong, but watching her work, watching her push through the physical exhaustion and the weight of her grief, made him realize just how much she had been holding in. She didn't talk much about her father anymore, didn't mention the promise he'd made or the hopes she had clung to for so long. It was as if that part of her life had started to fade into the background, no longer the defining thing about her. She was becoming something else, someone else. And Isaac was starting to believe that maybe he was becoming someone else too. One afternoon, they were working together in the stables, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Isaac had just finished mucking out a stall when he saw Adele standing at the far end of the barn, her head tilted to the side as she studied the horses. She had a look on her face that he had seen before. A look of quiet contemplation, as if she was searching for something just beyond her reach. Isaac walked over to her, wiping the sweat from his brow, his voice soft as he approached. "You all right?" Adele didn't turn to face him right away. Instead, she reached out to stroke the nose of a dark chestnut mare that stood in front of her, the horse's warm breath clouding in the cold air. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it, like she was preparing herself for something. Isaac waited, not rushing her to speak, knowing that she would say what she needed to when she was ready. "I think it's time," Adele continued, her eyes still on the horse. "I think it's time for me to stop living in the past. I've been here for weeks now, and I've learned a lot. About work, about myself. But I need to start doing more than just surviving." Isaac stepped closer, nodding slowly. What are you thinking? Adele turned to him, then her expression steady but filled with something that Isaac recognized: purpose. I want to start learning more. About ranching. About the land. I've worked with horses, but I want to do more. I want to understand how it all fits together. I don't just want to be someone who does the work, I want to be someone who understands it. Isaac felt a surge of pride for her. She wasn't just taking on the physical challenges anymore. She was beginning to think beyond the work itself, starting to see the bigger picture. He had never doubted her potential, but this was something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about finding a place for herself. It was about finding a purpose that went beyond the pain, beyond the waiting. I think that's a damn good idea, Isaac said, his voice warm with approval. I've seen what you can do. You're already more than capable. You've got the grit to make it. And if you're ready, I'm happy to teach you. Adele's smile was small but genuine, and for the first time in a long time, Isaac saw something in her that reminded him of himself. An understanding that the road to growth wasn't easy, but it was worth the effort. I'm ready, she said quietly, her voice steady. I want to learn. Isaac nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in days. We'll start tomorrow then. There's plenty to teach, and I'm sure you'll catch on quick. It won't be easy, but you'll get the hang of it. Adele gave him a nod, her eyes reflecting the quiet determination that had always been there even when she hadn't recognized it in herself. She was stepping into a new version of her life, one that was built on more than just survival. It was about living, about claiming her place in the world, and Isaac could see that she was finally ready to do just that. They spent the rest of the afternoon working together, the sound of hooves and the quiet murmur of their conversation filling the barn. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the snow, Isaac realized that things had changed both for Adele and for himself. They were no longer just two people trying to survive in a world that had already taken so much from them. They were starting to build something that had a future even if it was uncertain. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and learning. Adele's days were filled with lessons about the land, the horses, the daily rhythms of ranch life. Isaac taught her everything he knew: how to handle the animals, how to care for the land, how to read the weather and the signs of the seasons. They spent hours together working side by side, and in those moments, Adele began to see herself not just as someone who was stuck in the past, but as someone who was shaping her future. It wasn't always easy. There were days when Adele wanted to give up, when the work seemed too hard, and the weight of everything she had lost threatened to pull her under. But Isaac was there, steady and unyielding, his quiet encouragement always there when she needed it most. And slowly she began to believe in herself in a way she never had before. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the porch of the cabin, the last light of the day fading into the horizon. Isaac leaned back in his chair, his boots propped up on the railing, while Adele sat beside him, her fingers idly tracing the edge of her coffee cup. The world around them was still, the night air crisp and clear. Adele spoke first, her voice low, but filled with a quiet sense of certainty. I'm starting to feel like I'm part of this, Isaac. Like I'm not just here to pass time anymore. Isaac looked over at her, his expression softening. You've always been part of this, Adele. You just had to see it for yourself. Adele's smile was small, but it was real. It was the first smile he had seen from her that didn't come with hesitation, that didn't hide behind the walls she had built for so long. It was a smile that reflected everything she had worked for and everything she was becoming. The silence between them was comfortable, and for the first time since they had started this journey, Isaac felt like they had found their place in the world. The road ahead wasn't clear, and there were still challenges to face. But whatever came, they would face it together. And for Isaac, that was enough. Adele turned her gaze to the horizon, the quiet determination in her eyes stronger than ever. "I think I'm finally ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the kind of conviction that came from knowing who she was and what she could do. "Ready to move on. Ready to make something of this life." Isaac nodded, his heart full. "You already have, Adele. You already have." The air was thick with the smell of horses and hay as Isaac and Adele worked together to care for the animals. The ranch was busy, the rhythmic sound of hooves in the distance, the low murmur of voices carrying through the barn. Adele's hands were calloused now, her movements smooth as she worked. She had learned quickly, and every day she grew more confident. Isaac couldn't help but watch her, a quiet sense of pride filling his chest. She had come so far in such a short time. It wasn't just the work that had changed her. It was the way she carried herself now. When she first arrived, she had been a girl on the edge, weighed down by loss and uncertainty. Now she moved with purpose, her steps firm and steady. She had found her place here. And Isaac had found a peace he hadn't known he needed, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he had been searching for. "Almost done," Isaac called over his shoulder, his voice low but warm. Adele looked up from where she was brushing down one of the horses, the creature standing quietly as she worked. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her smile small but genuine. "Almost. Just a few more." Isaac nodded and went to work on the other side of the barn. He was glad she had taken to the ranch life so well. There had been times when he feared she would walk away, when the weight of her past might pull her back into the shadows. But now she seemed anchored here, grounded in the work and the routine they had built together. He glanced at her again, watching her move with an ease that spoke volumes. "You've got a knack for this," he said, his voice soft but filled with pride. "You've come a long way." Adele paused, resting her hand on the horse's neck. She glanced over at Isaac, her eyes meeting his. "I never thought I would," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of all the things she hadn't said before. "I thought I was stuck, that there was nothing else for me." Isaac set his tools down, stepping closer to her. "You're not stuck anymore, Adele. You've built something here. You've made a place for yourself." Her eyes softened, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name passing through them. "I didn't know how to start. But you." She stopped, shaking her head slightly. "You showed me how." Isaac smiled, though there was a quiet sadness behind his gaze. He had never been good at letting people close, at letting anyone in. But with Adele, it was different. He had opened up in small ways, and now he realized that the bond they had formed, the trust they had built, was something that couldn't be taken away. "I didn't do much," Isaac said, his voice low. "You've done it. All of it." Adele's smile was small, but it held something deeper. "I couldn't have done it without you." Isaac felt a shift inside himself at her words. He wasn't used to being needed, but the way Adele spoke to him, with quiet trust and unwavering gratitude, made him feel like maybe he was doing something right. They finished their work in silence, the steady rhythm of the tasks grounding them both. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ranch. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the quiet beauty of the moment, a reflection of everything they had built together. As they made their way back to the cabin, the crisp evening air filled with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Isaac could hear the faint laughter of some of the ranch hands in the distance, their voices carried by the wind. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He turned to Adele, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "I know this isn't easy, but you're doing it. You're living again." Adele looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, something like peace. "I'm trying," she said, her voice steady. I think I'm finally starting to believe I can." Isaac nodded, his heart full. He had watched her grow, had watched her fight through the darkness of her past and step into the light of her future. He had seen the strength in her, the quiet determination that had always been there, hidden beneath the weight of grief. And now, as they walked side by side, he knew that she was no longer the girl who had been lost and waiting. She had found herself again. They reached the cabin, and Isaac opened the door, letting the warmth inside wash over them. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the room cozy and inviting. The scent of food drifted from the small kitchen, and Isaac felt a sense of contentment settle over him. This was home. Adele stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, the familiar comfort of it all washing over her. It wasn't just the cabin, it was the life they had built here. The work, the routines, the shared moments. It was everything she had been searching for without even knowing it. Isaac followed her inside, closing the door behind him. He turned to her, his gaze soft. "You know," he said, his voice low, "there's still a lot to learn. But you're ready. You've got everything you need." Adele met his gaze, her eyes full of something unspoken, something deep. "I think I've learned enough to know I'm not alone anymore." Isaac smiled, his heart warm at her words. They were no longer two people who had been lost. They were two people who had found each other and had found themselves in the process. Adele's gaze shifted to the small table where their dinner was set out, the simple meal a reminder of how far they had come. She took a step toward it, but then paused, turning to Isaac. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. I didn't think I'd ever get here." Isaac walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Adele. You got here all on your own." Adele's smile was small, but it was full of something that made Isaac's chest swell. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her voice steady. "I had you." The warmth of the fire flickered in the background, casting a soft glow over the room. Isaac stood there for a moment, watching Adele, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. They had both come so far, and no matter what happened next, they had each other. And that in itself was enough. They sat down to their meal, the comfort of the food, the warmth of the cabin, and the steady rhythm of their shared life filling the space between them. It was simple, but it was everything they needed. And in that moment, Isaac knew that no matter where the road ahead took them, they would walk it together. The days had grown longer, the sun beginning to feel a little warmer against the still chilly winds that swept across the plains. It was the kind of early spring where you could feel the earth shifting, waking up slowly from the frozen grip of winter. Isaac and Adele had been working together on the ranch for months now, their days filled with the steady rhythm of chores, the scent of hay and wood, the soft sounds of the animals around them. They had settled into a routine, but there was still something about this life that felt like a promise, a new beginning they were both still figuring out. Isaac had known it wouldn't be easy for Adele to shed the weight of her past, even with all the work, the hours spent on the land, the physical exhaustion that kept her mind occupied. But she was different now. The raw grief that had once held her captive was starting to loosen its grip. She was learning how to take each day, each small moment of quiet, and transform it into something she could hold on to. Isaac had seen her growth, but he knew there was still work to do. There always would be. One morning, just as the light was beginning to creep through the clouds, Adele came to him, her face set with determination. She had been quiet for the last few days, and Isaac had noticed the look in her eyes, the way she seemed to be wrestling with something inside herself. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady but filled with an urgency that caught Isaac's attention. She hadn't said much lately, but Isaac could feel her frustration in the way she avoided looking him in the eye, in the way she fidgeted with her hands. Isaac set down his tools, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone soft but concerned. "I've been thinking," Adele began, her voice low but firm, "about the ranch, about my life here. I've been doing the work. I've been surviving. But I need something more. I can't keep living like this, like I'm just waiting for something to change." Isaac straightened up, watching her carefully. There was a seriousness in her tone now, a new kind of resolve. He had seen her grow, seen the way she had stepped into this life, but now it seemed she was ready for more. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She wanted to take charge. "I've been learning a lot," she continued, her eyes finally meeting his. "About the land, about the horses, about how everything works together. But I think it's time I took on something bigger. I want to learn more. I want to be more than just someone who does the work. I want to understand it, to be able to run things." Isaac nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had never thought of the ranch as just a place to work. It had always been more than that for him, but hearing Adele speak about it with such conviction made him realize that she was seeing the same thing. She wasn't just doing the chores. She was beginning to understand what it meant to run this place, to own it in a way that went beyond the physical work. She wanted to learn how to lead, how to make decisions that would shape the future of the land. "I think you're ready for that," Isaac said, his voice steady. "You've come so far, Adele. But you need more than just the basics. You need to understand how this place works, how everything fits together." Adele's eyes sparkled with something Isaac couldn't quite name. Determination, yes, but something deeper, something that told him she wasn't just asking for a lesson. She was asking for a chance to prove herself. "I want to help with the management," she said, her voice filled with quiet urgency. "I want to learn about the business side of things, about how to handle the ranch, how to make decisions that matter." Isaac studied her for a long moment, his eyes tracing the lines of her face, the determination in her gaze. She had always been strong, but this was something different. She wasn't just asking for permission to be part of the ranch's future. She was demanding it. "You're not asking for much, are you?" Isaac said, his lips curling into a small smile. He could see the fire in her now, the same fire that had driven her to keep going when she had nothing left to hold on to. Adele smiled, though it was more of a relieved sigh than anything else. "I know it won't be easy, but I have to try. I've spent too much of my life waiting for things to happen to me. It's time I started making things happen." Isaac walked over to the small desk in the cabin, pulling out a few papers. "I think we can figure this out. You're right. It won't be easy, but I've seen what you can do. You've got the skills. You just need the knowledge." Adele stepped closer, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. This was the chance to make her own way, to stop being defined by what had happened to her and start defining herself by what she could do. She wasn't going to wait any longer. She was going to make something of herself, even if it meant facing challenges she wasn't sure she was ready for. Isaac handed her the papers, his expression serious now. "This is the financial side of the ranch. You'll need to understand how the profits work, how the crops, the cattle, and the horses all factor into the bigger picture. We'll start slow, but you've got to learn it all." "You ready?" Adele took the papers from him, her fingers brushing against his for a split second. She looked down at the numbers, the columns of figures that had once seemed so foreign to her, and for the first time she felt like she understood them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about waiting. It was about taking control, about learning how to shape the future, instead of letting it happen to her. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice firm with a conviction that surprised even her. Isaac nodded, his face softening with approval. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. You've got a lot to learn, but I know you can do it." The weight of the decision settled between them, but it wasn't a burden. It was a promise. A promise that Adele was finally stepping into her own life, into the future she was choosing for herself. It was a future that wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. And for the first time in a long time, Isaac felt like he had a part to play in it. Adele glanced out the window, her gaze drifting to the horizon. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this much: she wasn't waiting anymore. And that was enough to fill her with a quiet, steady kind of hope. The winter sun stretched long shadows across the frost-covered prairie, casting a silver glow over the ranch. Laurel stood at the fence line, her wool shawl tugged tightly around her shoulders. From behind, the soft crunch of boots approached, and she didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew those steps now. Boone's quiet, steady gait had become a rhythm in her world. "She's almost unrecognizable," he said beside her, gazing at Clara riding in slow circles on the sorrel mare. The girl sat tall, confident, her laughter carried by the wind as she leaned forward to whisper to the horse. Laurel's voice trembled with quiet awe. "Do you see it too? The way she's come alive here?" Boone nodded. "She never had roots before. Now she's got soil and sun and someone to water her. That makes a girl bloom." Laurel turned to him, her face worn but glowing. "And you, Boone? Do you ever wonder what made you open your door that day?" Boone shrugged, his hat pulled low. "Can't rightly say. Maybe I just saw myself in her. Someone half-starved for something they couldn't name." Inside the house, Annie wiped her hands on her apron and poked her head out the door. "Laurel, honey, telegram for you." Laurel frowned. Telegram. She hadn't received anything from the outside world since she'd arrived. The few folks who had known her life before, well, they didn't tend to send warm regards. She took the folded slip of paper, heart thudding, and scanned the message. Her hands fell limp at her sides. "What is it?" Boone asked. Laurel swallowed. "It's from Jane. My stepmother. She says she's coming. Tomorrow." Boone's jaw stiffened. "She knows you're here. I told no one. But she must have found out somehow. Maybe someone in town heard my name and word got back. She wants to see Clara." Clara had trotted over by then, curious. "Who's Jane?" she asked, breathless cheeks pink from the cold. Laurel hesitated. "She's someone from before." Boone crouched down to Clara's level. "You remember that some people didn't treat your mama kindly?" Clara nodded solemnly. "Well, she was one of them." Clara's brows knit together. "Then why is she coming here?" That, Laurel said with a deep breath, is what I intend to find out. The following day, the sound of wheels crunching over snow broke the ranch's early stillness. Laurel stood tall in her plain dress, hands folded over her apron, flanked by Boone and Clara. Jane stepped out of the black carriage like the frost itself, elegant, sharp-edged, her eyes raking the ranch with thinly veiled disdain. Her fur-trimmed coat looked like it belonged in a city drawing room, not out here among livestock and wind. Laurel, Jane said coolly, "So this is where you've run to." "I didn't run," Laurel replied evenly. "I left." Jane's gaze slid to Clara. "And you brought the child." "I didn't bring her," Laurel said. "She found me." Clara looked between them, confusion furrowing her brow. "I heard you were playing family out here?" Jane sniffed. "Couldn't resist seeing it with my own eyes." You came all this way to mock me. I came because Clara is mine by blood. Her mother was my husband's niece. I took her in when no one else would. That child is not yours to keep, Laurel. Boone took one step forward, eyes dark. She's not property, and she sure ain't yours just because you once locked her in a shed. Jane's eyes narrowed. You know nothing about it. I know enough, Boone growled. I've seen the bruises fade on her arms, heard her crying in her sleep. Laurel's hands trembled, but her voice held firm. You made her believe she was nothing, but I watched her become everything. Clara moved closer to Laurel, slipping her hand into hers. She doesn't want you, Laurel said, and you have no right to demand her now, not after everything. I raised her, Jane snapped. You used her, Laurel replied. Jane's lips tightened. If you don't hand her over, I'll go to the sheriff. I have papers. Laurel's heart sank, but she kept her posture straight. Then go. We'll be right behind you. Boone placed a hand on Laurel's back. You won't be alone. That afternoon they rode into town. The air inside the sheriff's office was stale and tense. Sheriff Langley leaned back in his chair, watching them with a slow, measured gaze. You're saying you want custody of this child, ma'am? He asked Jane. I'm her blood relative. Blood ain't always thicker than decency, Boone muttered. Laurel stepped forward. Sheriff, I'd like to speak. Langley nodded. I didn't steal Clara. She was found alone, freezing outside a storehouse in the middle of winter. You can ask Doc Harper in town, he treated her. She had scars. She was starving, and she's been here ever since. This ranch is her home. Jane crossed her arms. She's my responsibility, not yours. The sheriff looked to Clara, who clutched Laurel's hand tightly. Clara, do you know this woman? Clara's voice was small but clear. She's the one who told me I ruined everything, who said I was nothing. Laurel knelt beside her. What do you want, Clara? Not what anyone else wants, what you want. Clara looked at Jane, then at Laurel. I want to stay with Mama Laurel. I want to stay home. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Sheriff Langley cleared his throat. I'll write up a guardianship petition, but it'll take time. You'll need to sign affidavits. There may be hearings. It's not done in a day. I'll do whatever it takes, Laurel said. Jane turned to leave, her expression unreadable. Fine, let her stay. You'll see what kind of burden love can be. But Boone watched her go with a sharp gaze. Love ain't a burden. It's what pulls a man up out of the dark. That night, back at the ranch, Clara curled up in Laurel's arms by the fire. Boone brought in extra wood and set it gently in the hearth, the flames flickering gold across their faces. She's not coming back, is she? Clara asked. Laurel pressed a kiss to her forehead. Not if I can help it, baby girl. Boone sat beside them and leaned his shoulder into Laurel's. We'll fight for her. For you, for all of it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent like a clean beginning. Inside, warmth pulsed in steady rhythm, wood crackling hearts, mending a child finally safe. And deep in Boone's chest, a quiet promise took root, something unsaid but fierce. He would not let the world take from him what had only just begun to feel like home. The courthouse door creaked shut behind them, the weight of the hearing pressing on Laurel's shoulders like a yoke she hadn't noticed until it lifted. The sheriff had filed the petition, and Clara's voice had held firm in that quiet room, steady and brave. Her fingers curled tightly in Laurel's hand. It would take time, yes, but the tide had turned. Boone stood beside her as they descended the wooden steps into the chill, the low winter sun lighting his face in amber. He didn't speak at first, just stood taking in the quiet dignity of her posture, The tension in her jaw, the way her eyes watched Clara trot ahead toward the wagon, like someone newly free but still unsure of her footing. "She's yours in every way that counts," Boone finally said. "I reckon even the law knows that now." Laurel exhaled slowly. "Thank you for standing with me in there." "I didn't do it for thanks," Boone said. "Did it because no one should have to fight that alone. Least of all someone who's fought so much already." They rode home in silence, the wheels rattling over icy ruts. Clara leaned her head on Laurel's shoulder, nodding off before they turned onto the familiar stretch of road leading to the ranch. Boone reached across the bench and tucked a blanket around her small form. When they reached the barn, Boone pulled the horses in, and Laurel lifted Clara gently, cradling her like something sacred. Boone watched as she carried the girl inside past the flickering hearth, up the creaking stairs, and into the quiet bedroom. He saw the tenderness in her hands, the fierce grace in her spine. He had watched many things grow over the years, crops, calves, seasons changing, but watching Laurel become a mother had changed something deep inside him. By the time Laurel returned to the front room, the fire was blazing strong. Boone was there pouring 2 mugs of coffee, his rough hands oddly delicate as he handed one to her. "You need rest," he said. She smiled softly. "It's not just rest I need, Boone. I need to know this won't all slip away. That what we're building here. It matters. It matters to me," he said. There was silence then, long and alive. Boone shifted, then reached into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small folded paper. "I wasn't going to show you yet. Figured you had enough on your shoulders. But maybe now's the time." Laurel unfolded the paper slowly. It was a deed, a land deed. Her breath caught. "You put my name on the ranch." Boone nodded, his voice low. "Half of it. I ain't fool enough to let go of something I built from sweat and dirt. But I also ain't fool enough to pretend you didn't save it. Save me. Save that little girl, too." Her hands trembled, fingertips brushing the ink like she couldn't believe it was real. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You already did," he said. "You just didn't know it yet." She looked up at him, tears brimming. "Why, Boone?" He met her eyes, the weight of a man who had lived too long with silence. "Because I watched you walk into fire for her. I watched you carry a girl's pain like it was your own. I've seen women leave, seen 'em fold, seen 'em cry and curse and run, but I've never seen anyone stand like you do, quiet and steady even when your whole world shakes." She looked down at the deed again. "You made her believe she was nothing," Boone said softly, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "But I watched her become everything, and it was you who did that." Laurel stepped forward, then closer to him than she'd ever dared. Her voice was a breath. "You've given us more than land." Boone reached out, resting a calloused hand over hers, where she still held the paper. "I've given you what I got. The rest, I hope we build together." The fire popped gently, a spark rising into the chimney like a prayer. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Laurel lay in her room, the deed still folded neatly on the nightstand. The weight of it wasn't just ink or ownership. It was a trust, a binding of souls and soil. She could still feel Boone's voice in her bones. Outside her window, the wind brushed across the fields, whispering over the snow-crusted fence lines like a hymn. Somewhere beyond, a coyote called out low and long. It sounded less like mourning and more like acknowledgement, as if the land itself knew something had changed. In the morning, Clara woke with a bright smile and a hunger for grits and jam. She danced into the kitchen barefoot, her curls wild, and her voice singing nonsense as she helped Annie stir the pot on the stove. Boone was already outside, splitting wood, his coat hanging open despite the cold, his shirt damp with sweat. Laurel stepped onto the porch, watching him. His rhythm was sure, each strike of the axe a punctuation mark in the crisp air. He paused when he noticed her straightening, brushing his hands on his pants. "Thought you might need some kindling," he said. "I thought I might need something stronger than coffee," she said with a laugh. Boone walked over his boots, crunching in the snow. He looked at her for a long moment. "There's something else I should tell you. Something that's been sittin' on me." Her laughter faded. "What is it?" He pulled a letter from his pocket. "This came a few days ago. From a man named Samuel. Said he used to know your father. Said he's heard about Clara's case and that her blood relatives are stirring up something in another county." Laurel's stomach dropped. What kind of something, he didn't say. Just that we should be ready. That not everyone's gonna accept a rancher and a woman like you raising a girl who ain't blood. Laurel stared at the letter, then up at Boone. "I thought we had time." "You still do," Boone said. "But you also got fight left in you." "I seen it." Clara burst onto the porch, then holding a biscuit in one hand, her smile wide. "Mama Laurel, can I ride my horse today?" Laurel knelt, brushing a crumb off the girl's chin. "Only if you promise not to outrun Boone's old legs again." Clara giggled and ran off, her boots thumping across the boards. Laurel stood slowly, turning back to Boone. "If they come for her, they'll find she's got a whole ranch behind her." She nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The cold wind cut across the field, but inside Laurel's chest something was burning warm. She was no longer running, no longer afraid. The land was hers now, not just on paper, but in purpose. And she would protect that girl with everything she had. Because she wasn't just building a life anymore, she was defending one. The wind blew strong off the plains, snapping the wash dry on the line, as Laurel stepped out onto the porch. Her coat tight around her waist, boots wet with slush. Clara was riding the bay pony in a wide circle out by the south pasture, Boone not far behind, his watchful eyes never straying far from the girl's small frame. Every so often, she'd lean forward and whisper something in the pony's ear, like they shared secrets no grown soul could understand. Laurel watched them, her hand unconsciously brushing the pocket where she kept the folded deed. It still didn't feel real. That paper held weight not just of land, but of belonging, of being seen, of Boone's quiet way of saying, "I trust you." But it was Clara's laughter that mattered more than any document. It was the freedom in that child's voice that told her they were doing something right. Annie stepped out beside her, drying her hands on her apron. "Mail came," she said, "from Silver Falls." Laurel turned. Samuel. Annie nodded, her face pinched. "Says Clara's uncle's stirring up talk. A lawyer's been seen near the circuit judge. They're trying to claim she was taken without consent." Laurel felt the air grow thin. "They're making it legal." Annie handed her the letter. Boone should read it. Laurel's boots found him in the barn, oil lantern casting soft shadows across the beams. Boone was working on a broken gate hinge, sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow despite the cold. He glanced up as she entered. "Clara's getting better with that pony," he said. Laurel held out the letter, her voice flat. "We've got trouble." He read it slowly, jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he folded it once neatly and looked at her. "They want to take her. They'll try." Boone's hand moved to the old branding iron leaning by the stall. He didn't pick it up, just stared at it, like he could burn the past back into the wood of the barn if he tried hard enough. "You think they'll come here?" Laurel asked. He nodded. "With a marshal, maybe. Or court papers. I won't give her up." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I won't let you." Her eyes welled. "Boone, I know, he said gently, cutting her off. We'll fight it. I've already talked to Joe down at the notary. He's seen the guardianship filing. And that judge in Red Fork knows Clara's story. He remembers her father. They'll say she was property, passed down like land or stock. Laurel's voice broke on the word. Boone's jaw set. That girl ain't property. She's a person. And if the law can't see that, then the law's blind. They didn't sleep much that night. Laurel sat by the fire while Clara lay curled under quilts in the room next door. She watched the flames flicker low and thought of the old collar she'd found in Clara's trunk when they first brought her here. Worn leather bent buckle like a tether meant to mark her. That night she burned it, took it out behind the barn, lit it with oil and a match, and watched the leather curl and blacken like a curse breaking. Boone stood beside her, silent, holding her coat closed, as the flames licked the night air. She won't wear that weight again, Laurel said. No, she won't, Boone answered. Not while we're breathing. The next day brought the law. A tall man in a black coat rode up just after noon, his horse slick with frost and miles. Behind him came another younger, a lawyer, judging by the paper case he carried. Boone was already saddling his gelding. Laurel met the men in front of the barn. Her spine straight, her hands hidden in her pockets so they wouldn't shake. Ma'am, the marshal said, touching his hat. We've come on official business. There's a petition filed regarding custody of a minor child. We need you to come with us to Red Fork tomorrow morning. Is she being taken? Laurel asked. No, ma'am, the lawyer answered, pulling a paper from his case. Not without a hearing. But you'll need to answer some questions. The family's claiming illegal guardianship. Says the girl was taken from kin. Boone stepped forward. She was taken from chains, from a shed, and she was bleeding. The lawyer looked uncomfortable. That may be, but the law requires consent for transfer of care. Laurel's voice cracked like ice. And what does the law say about collars, about treating a child like livestock? The marshal frowned. The judge'll hear it all. You'll have a chance to speak. We'll be there, Boone said, but don't think we'll be handing her over. No one said you had to, the marshal replied, but the court might. They left without further word. Laurel didn't watch them go. She stood staring at the bare fields stretching out behind the barn, the gray sky settling low like sorrow. That night, Boone brought Clara into the parlor and sat her on his knee. You remember how we talked about promises, he asked her. She nodded, wide-eyed. Well, there's a place we have to go, to talk to some folks about what's best for you. And I want you to know, no matter what they say, I'm staying here. Clara interrupted, her voice small but sure. You said I'm not a horse to be traded. You said I was yours. Laurel knelt beside her, taking her hand. You're not a thing. You're a person. And we'll fight to keep you safe. Clara looked down, then back up. Can I bring my pony? Boone chuckled softly. We'll see. They left before dawn, the wagon packed Annie staying behind to tend the ranch. As they rode toward Red Fork, the sun rose slowly behind them, casting gold across the frozen fields. Laurel held Clara tight under a quilt, Boone driving steady, his eyes fixed ahead. They weren't just going to a courtroom. They were walking into a reckoning, a place where men with pens and gavels would try to name what couldn't be named. But Laurel knew this much was true. Clara had been given to a man as if she were nothing, but she would not return as nothing. She was a child now claimed by love, by dignity, by her own voice. And they would not go quietly. The educational lesson learned from this story is that healing often begins the moment someone chooses to see us as human rather than as a burden or a label. No person should be treated like property, especially not a child, and no past shame is stronger than the power of compassion, consistency, and dignity. We're reminded that love backed by action can break generational patterns of harm even in the face of rigid laws and cold traditions. In the quiet, steady choices we make to protect and uplift others, we often discover our own worth too.